first session this evening, we talked about the Sadducees, who, for all intents and purposes, disappear at the end of the first century because most of them are killed off at the time when the Jerusalem temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is sacked by Rome. But there is one group that is able to survive that because, for the most part, they are not in Jerusalem itself. They are throughout all of Galilee and Judah outside of the bands of Jerusalem itself, and they are the Pharisees, and that's who we want to look at now in this second session. So who were the Pharisees? They were lay persons. They were not priests. They had a desire for all Jews to be able to take the faith seriously. And by that, what I mean is that the rules that occur within the pages of the Old Testament for the priests to follow, the Pharisees wanted to apply those rules to all Jews, whether they were priests or not. They took, in other words, the words of Exodus 19:6, where the Hebrews are said to become a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. They took those words very seriously and, as I said, wanted to apply them to all Jews. They originated most likely during the Hasmonean or Maccabean Revolution during the 160s BC. And one of the Jewish historians in the first century says that there were only 6,000 Pharisees in all of Judea, which means that there were not really very many of them at all. For some perspective, there were actually 20,000 priests, but there were only 6,000 Pharisees. What kinds of persons were they? Well, for the most part, we would call them rabbis. They were not priests, but they were leaders in the local synagogues that were spread throughout all of Galilee and through Judah. And they were located, therefore, in towns and in villages and in cities, probably not for the most part in rural areas, because you had to have a minimum number of Jews to be able to actually have a synagogue meeting. So they were in cities and in villages throughout mostly Galilee. For the most part, the Pharisees were interested in the law in the same way that the Sadducees were, but the way they understood the law was rather different. They wanted, as I said, to implement holiness to all the persons throughout all of Judea and Galilee. Well, how would they do that? The same way that you and I do with our children. There were positive ways and there were negative ways that they wanted to introduce laws to them. We know that there are 10 commands that appear within the pages of Exodus, but the Pharisees found ways to see that there were many, many more laws within the pages of Scripture. They actually came up with 613 laws within the pages of Scripture. There were 365 negative laws and there were 248 positive laws. In other words, there were 365 thou shalt nots and there were 248 thou shalts. If you add those up, it comes to 613. That's one negative law for every day of the year. And if you remember your anatomy from 7th grade science classes, that's one positive law for every bone and major organ in a human body. Those 613 laws were not laws that they just made up helter-skelter. They found every single one of those laws, whether they were positive or negative, from within the pages of Scripture itself, within the Torah, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. But in addition to the 10 commands and in addition to the 613 laws, they also came up with what they called the fencing laws. These are the kinds of laws that you as good parents use with your children when you want to keep them safe. You tell them, don't go out into the street to play, but then you begin fencing that law by telling them, before you go out in the street, look left, look right. Hold the hand of a sibling before you go out there. Don't you dare go out of the yard until you get my permission. Each one of those laws is a fence around the important law of not going out into the street. The Pharisees did exactly the same thing. So they would take, for instance, one of the 10 commands to, let's say, keep the Sabbath holy. Then they would begin to put fences around those particular laws because people would ask the obvious questions, how do I keep the Sabbath holy? And some of the fences that they put in place to help you keep the Sabbath holy were things like this. Don't look in the mirror on the Sabbath. Well, why shouldn't you look in the mirror on the Sabbath? Because if you did, you would probably be like I am. When I look in the mirror, you would discover that there is a hair out of place. And so looking in the mirror, you would begin to put that hair back into place. And if you're looking at my fingers, you can see that I'm doing something that can be mistaken for farming. I am furrowing. So I am working on the Sabbath. I've just broken the Sabbath and I'm not keeping it holy. So a fence law is don't look in the mirror, because if you don't look in the mirror, you won't try to put your hair back like it is supposed to be. Lots and lots of fun laws that we could talk about like that, that the Pharisees came up with. There were two types of Pharisees in the first century. There were actually conservative Pharisees and liberal Pharisees. Now, it may be that we should use words like strict and lenient so that we get away from the 21st century political ramifications of these terms, but conservative and liberal still does work fairly well, I think, so I'll use those this evening. Conservative and liberal Pharisees. Hillel was one particular Pharisee, actually lived a very long time. He lived to be almost 120 years old as Moses. He was actually a liberal Pharisee. He had a grandson whose name was Gamaliel. He shows up within the pages of Scripture itself. He's in fact the one who was able to make sure that the Sadducees did not kill off Jesus' apostles. And the other reason why he shows up in the pages of the New Testament is because he actually is St. Paul's teacher. He is a grandson of Hillel, the liberal Pharisee, which should, if you think about that, that makes Paul a liberal, not a conservative Pharisee. Because they were liberal Pharisees, they wanted to deal with not with the letter of the law, but with the meaning of the law. And they were willing to let you get by with things that the conservative Pharisees would not. An example of a conservative Pharisee would be Shammai, who started a different school. He didn't live quite as long as Hillel did, but he did live the entire time that Jesus was alive. And as I suggested, he was a conservative Pharisee. Well, what's the main difference? The liberal Pharisees said that if we're going to look at those laws that appear within the pages of Scripture, as well as the fencing laws, what is most important are the 10 commands themselves. So if you have some kind of a law that shows up among the 613 versus the 10, if there is a problem keeping one or the other, you keep the 10 commands and you let the 613 commands go by the wayside. And even more so, if one of the fencing laws causes problems, keeps you from being able to keep one of the 10 commands, then you keep one of the 10 commands and you don't worry about the fencing laws. Shammai's group, on the other hand, said a law is a law is a law, and you must keep it even if it is a fencing law. It was equal primacy among all of the laws. Well, so was Jesus a Pharisee? It's a good question. He was a layperson, just like all of the Pharisees were. And he, like all of the Pharisees, expected all of his followers to practice piety and put in place holiness. He was a rabbi. He had disciples who followed him, who listened to what he said. He was adept at biblical interpretation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a Pharisee. It just means that he was like the Pharisees. He certainly was not like the Sadducees or any of the other groups that we've looked at, but he was very similar to the Pharisees. And that means then that when the Pharisees are coming up to Jesus throughout the pages of Holy Scripture, whether it is, for instance, in Matthew 12 or in Matthew 15, when they're talking with Jesus, what they are effectively trying to figure out is which one of these two major schools does Jesus participate in. He looks like a Pharisee, he smells like a Pharisee, in their eyes he is a Pharisee, but having decided that, is he a conservative one or is he a liberal one? As I said, he's not a Pharisee, so ultimately there are some issues there, but I don't have time to get into those this evening. But I do have one thing I want to suggest in conclusion tonight, and that is this. For the most part, when we Christians look at Pharisees these days, we continue to do what has been done for the last several centuries, and that is we paint the Pharisees as if they were these self-righteous hypocrites. That is a straw man. It never existed. Jews in the first century would no more have followed a self-righteous hypocrite then than we would today. But it doesn't do us any good to simply put forth a straw man and then dismantle it and say how foolish they were. You should look at us Christians to live the right way. It doesn't work if a Republican makes a straw liberal, defeats it and says, now you should become a part of us, or if a liberal makes a straw Republican and then defeats it and says you should become like us. That never convinces anybody. You should take them on their own particular grounds and recognize that the Pharisees were terribly important within their day. How important? Well, the Pharisees represented the Jewish populace at large very well. They reinvigorated biblical instruction for the Jews in their day. They took leading roles in the synagogues. They explained theology to persons in a way that they were able to understand. And ultimately, they are the ones, since they survived the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, they are the ones who lay the groundwork for what becomes the resilient Judaism that the world has known for these last 1,600 years. Never mind, they are the ones that compiled the Talmud, the Mishnah, and all of the other documents that we think are so important for Judaism today. After you listen to James and his presentation on the art this evening, remember that there are some questions in your books that you should take some time and look at and to reflect upon. And then there are also 3 different meditations for the Stations of the Cross in this particular chapter as well.